Donald Trump changed how I teach U.S. history. This episode is about the USA changes, the classroom changes that came along with the 2016 election and carry through to today. As someone who was alive and taught briefly before Trump and now teaches after Trump, I want to explain some things that are different now. Now that he's out of office, saying he's going to run again, but we live in a post-Trump world. We have been changed, we have been politicized, and we cannot go back. I want to offer a brief disclaimer that any story I share is from a time where anyone involved is long graduated and long a legal adult. Obviously, I won't be saying any names, but any stories will be from a time with no current student of my own. With that, I hope you enjoy listening. So, to tell this story, I want to start with United States politics in general, from what it looked like to me as a young person. It's so funny, like when you get to a certain age, you feel so far removed from ever having been a minor, one of the most protected groups in this nation people care about, because when you turn 30, people stop caring about protecting you and about your rights and all that kind of stuff. But yep, I once was a teenager. I once was a young person who experienced politics in this country. So this is the rise of liberalism from 2008 to 2016. I can't even remember how I felt about the election between Obama and McCain in 2008. I did not stay up all night. I did not track the Electoral College. 2008, I was a sophomore in high school, so I wasn't too concerned about the future of politics in this country. And I kind of always reference the 2008 election as the last election that had two pretty decent quote-unquote candidates. I am not a McCain fan now in retrospect, but a lot of people were McCain fans, and people, after his passing still think of him respectfully, which is more than can be said about some politicians. But it felt pretty low stakes. American presidential elections still were not as politicized as they would become. I know there was a lot of backlash with the Bush election in 2000 due to Al Gore winning the popular vote and originally him being projected as the winner. But I was not cognizant of any kind of controversy at that time. So 2008 was the first election that I remember. And even the election of 2004, I just feel like I remember that you just expected a president to serve 2 terms, because I had not lived through a one-term president. And actually, Trump was my first one-term president. Let's celebrate that and let's keep it that way. Anyway, I remember paying more attention to the 2012 election than the 2008 election between Obama and Mitt Romney. And funnily enough, I was in college at this point. I was on Tumblr because Tumblr was huge during this year, and I was seeing memes, and I got the vibe that Obama needed to win re-election and that Mitt Romney was bad news. I can't say I know anything about Mitt Romney, so I can only tell you what I felt. I certainly didn't know anything about Mitt Romney back then, and I still don't. So I can't speak to the fact of, would he been better? But I really like Obama, and I've always liked Obama. Oh, and I forgot the biggest thing. The 2012 election was the first election I voted in for Obama. So that was the 2012 election. I did not stay up. I went to bed. I woke up to the news that Obama had won re-election, and that was the last presidential election I suspect that will not stress me out. So, what did politics look like from the years 2008 to 2016? Bush was a Republican. The nation was reeling from 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina. I think generally leaned more conservative, although there was a big anti-war push. And we were approaching a time in American history where it was time to get with the times, and gay marriage was becoming more and more accepted. I remember specifically like 2003, Massachusetts was the first state to allow domestic partnerships. And I remember state by state allowing gay marriage. I think 2011, New York allowed gay marriage. And then finally in 2015, gay marriage was made federal across all states. And coming out in the late 2000s, I think was not. I think it's easy now, and I think it's not easy now for different reasons. But it was pretty smooth in the late 2000s. And this was in the time of Katy Perry Firework, Lady Gaga Born This Way, Kesha, Glee, all of these shows and all of this music that, live loud, live proud, be yourself. And, America, to me, it seemed like it was only heading in one direction. This is it. This is the time of progress. This is the time of moving forward. This is the time of gay acceptance. And, that carried all the way through 2015. The other thing that I was enlightened to during this time period was feminism. Throughout my college experience, I learned, everyone around me that was close to me and my family was mainly women, except for two people, my father and my uncle. And, I was learning more and about how women were mistreated, historically. The early 2010s were like a big push for feminism, and also like the first big backlash circa 2016. So it still would be a couple years, but I had never considered myself a feminist before college, but I left college proudly identifying as a feminist. So that was my mentality going into the 2016 election. We're only going up. Progress is going in one direction. We've waited this long. Gay marriage, we had our first black president. Then we have gay marriage. Then we're going to have our first woman president. Like, in my head, this was history. This is how history worked. We only went forward. We didn't go backward. And boy, was everyone who felt like me shocked and appalled at the results of the 2016 election. So the next section I titled The Revenge of Conservatism from 2016 to 2024, and that is going to kind of encompass the next section as well. So I think this is going to be a little less structured because we still are seeing the unfolding of the backswing of the pendulum. We haven't still gone completely to the point where conservatives are satisfied and the left are appalled, so then it kind of swings back. So we are still very much on the swing back towards conservatism, and so that's what I wanted to talk about in this section. I got my teaching job when I was 22 in 2016. I enjoyed a few precious months of Obama, and then Trump was elected in November of my first year of teaching. And it was so funny, because I do a lot of Halloween shopping. I saw at Party City they had like Trump masks and Hillary masks, like paper ones, not like, big plastic ones or whatever. And I was going to buy both of those and put them on my wall next to Obama, and then leave the winner up there for the following day when the results were announced. I didn't end up doing that, but I was like, I even had a conservative leaning student at the time that was like, Hillary's probably going to win anyway. And I'm like, yeah, because again, that's just that in my head was the next direction that history was going to go in. So the next day, I wore all black, and I wore that's a tongue twister. I wore a white rose, which I don't know if that would fly today. I was much more brave back then. I was much more adamant back then. I was much more fight the system back then, and now I've been a little beaten down. But people ask me why I wore all black. One student was even like, "Is it because our country has died or something like that?" And it was a really sad day. I remember it was gloomy, and all the people that I worked with were just like, it was like a shared bad thing. That's all I can describe it. Everyone was feeling it. And then, of course, a teacher who's since retired and someone I still work with made me cry first period, first thing in the morning before, the kids came in, because they were telling me, you have to grin and bear it. You can't show it, can't, and I was just obviously so overwhelmed that I just like burst out crying. Anyway, my attitude towards teaching was like, I'm going to tell these kids the truth. I'm going to tell these kids that Trump is bad. One member of my family was even like, you can't do that. You have to play both sides. And at that time, I only very clearly saw how there could be one side. I was like, there's good and bad, and this is bad. I have to tell this to my students. I have to, teach them history right and all that kind of stuff. So that was my first inclination kind of stepping into the classroom. Now, I don't remember specifically any teaching issues regarding Trump that I had during his presidency, except for I ordered this like teacher set of president cards that I display in the front of my room. And when there's a new president, you can't order just the new president's card. You have to order the whole set again. And they come on this big cardboard sheet and you just punch them out. So for a while, I was missing Trump, and I needed to muster up the courage to like in the drive to print out a picture that I felt was unbiased. And on the very first day of school, I think the following year, someone left a Post-it note next to Obama and said, "Where's Trump?" So it's like, Jesus Christ, whatever. Fast forward, I did end up ordering a new set with Trump. So Trump is up there, and now Biden's up there with his own picture. And, we'll see how many presidents I wait before I order a new set of these cards. That's neither here nor there. The first thing that I remember specifically that affected me, that, wow, things have changed, the United States has changed, schools have changed, was the following election, the 2020 election. In the 2020 election, I remember this specifically. I made myself sick. I just was beside myself. I could not imagine another 4 years of Trump. For any left-leaning person listening, you have to remember that Biden was a way better choice in 2020 than he was now. We were much more optimistic about Biden than we are now. But it was like, I just was so sick to my stomach. The election was on a Tuesday, but I had voted already ahead of time, and the election results were not announced that night. So, and by the way, when I went to bed on Tuesday, like literally the entire country was lit up in red. So I was beside myself. I couldn't sleep. I literally didn't go to work for the next 3 days. I didn't go to work for the rest of the week because I just could not. And then it was Saturday, which was just unlike anything I've ever experienced. I was in Syracuse. I was getting my hair cut, and they announced that Biden was the winner on Saturday. So from Tuesday to Saturday, we did not have a result. Insane. So when they announced that Biden had won, I just felt an immense weight off my shoulders. I was so happy, and I went in Monday to, as delicately as possible, report the results of the election. So here's where we kind of get into the first thing here. I am a U.S. history teacher, so in my opinion, current events, especially ones, like you can't get any more U.S. history than a presidential election, it was a no-brainer. I had to tell my kids, right? So I report the results of the election, and immediately I got pushback that this election is fake. This election was rigged. Biden isn't actually going to be the winner. I posted an Instagram on my teacher Instagram saying that Biden had won, that he's our next president. People who had graduated even back then were commenting on it, saying that this was fake and that Biden is going to not be president anymore. And this leads us into our next section. Facts, fake news, and emotional triggers in the classroom. So now I had a unique problem I had reported facts that Biden had won the presidency, and in doing so, I had hurt children's feelings. Now, education, especially in New York, I know it's not the same in every state, but is very student-centric, very student emotions, very student needs, very student whatever, over the teacher's needs and all that kind of stuff, right? And you might be listening to this going, well, duh, it should be that way. But now, post-Trump, we live in a society where some people are offended by truth. And if this is a late discovery for me and you're listening and you're like, gee, took you long enough, I found that out way long ago, this was it. This was it for me. How do I approach facts, unbiased, that are going to hurt people's feelings and that is going to result in me being spoken to, which I was spoken to? In addition to that, how do I tell these kids that this is not a stolen and rigged election and Biden is not going to be overturned? That was a fact. And at that moment in 2020, 4 years ago, I did not feel freely to share that fact. And we even got correspondents to refrain from talking about the election results, especially in classes that didn't pertain to it. But again, I couldn't help but feel like it was about me. And to this day, I don't know if it was only me, but I teach U.S. history. So that was the first time that I was like, oh my God, education has changed. So there's a number of things that I teach about specifically in U.S. history that have changed post-Trump, that all of a sudden I now need to be sensitive of past history. I need to be sensitive about how I talk about the Civil War, because with Trump, some Civil War mentalities and opinions have come back, and they were wrong back then, in my opinion, and they're still wrong today. But now there are people who are offended about how I talk about the Civil War. And so that is something new to me. And here I have a list of topics. I think I already said that. You know how this goes. Okay, so the first one was election news, fact versus emotion. Am I allowed to say that Biden won legitimately? Say that it's not true that this was rigged? Say that he is going to be president and Trump is not going to take office back? I guess I still don't have an answer to that 4 years later. The next thing I wanted to talk about was Nazi flags versus Confederate flags. I definitely have gotten better at saying that the Confederate flag itself, a piece of fabric, is bad or racist. To say that a piece of fabric is bad or racist is kind of like a big, sweeping, bold statement, which, if we're speaking plainly, I think is true. But now it's post-Trump and we need nuance. Instead, now I teach that the people who wove that flag, I don't know if that's the right grammar, the people who waved that flag in battle were doing so to protect slavery. The Civil War was about one thing and one thing only, slavery. The Confederate flag was an associate symbol of that institution, right? Slavery is a racist ideal in this nation's history. So instead of telling my kids that the Confederate flag is also racist, I asked them, what do you suppose that means that people who wanted to keep slavery in this country would also wave this flag? And as an extension, would you personally own this flag? Or especially, how do we feel about this flag in New York State where these people have no business waving a Confederate flag? But the other part of the argument, which, because now we have to see both sides, and it's funny because I think people on the right would accuse people on the left of both sidesness, but now we have to be careful to include the conservative side of the argument as well. What if the Confederate flag is just for heritage? You know, okay, well, in my opinion, if you live in New York State and you never lived in the South and you don't plan on living in the South, you don't need to have the Confederate flag. In my opinion, during Trump's presidency, the Confederate flag became a symbol to piss people off. And people who proudly toted that symbol after his election wore it. I know houses with 5 Confederate flags and trucks with Confederate flags. That didn't happen because those people care about the South or Confederate flag. They did it because they knew it was a liberal own. They weren't politically correct, that they didn't have to be politically correct anymore, that their days of political correctness were over, and it was just a big FU. I do talk about the Nazi flag and how after World War II, the Nazi flag became illegal in Germany, and the Confederate flag is not illegal in the United States because we have freedom of speech. And we even talk about how Nazis were allowed to march in a largely Jewish neighborhood. Oh, I'm going to forget. I want to say it was in Skokie, Ohio. And the Supreme Court allowed them to do it because we have the freedom of assembly. So that, this poses a whole other question. Is too much freedom a good thing or a bad thing? And I would argue in some cases too much freedom, if you're allowing Nazis and you're allowing Confederate flags, at the very least is annoying. The next classroom discussion that was highlighted in Trump's presidency was, quote, critical race theory, unquote. The idea that racism is systematically a part of the United States' blood, and most, if not all, institutions that exist today are a result of that racism, and especially slavery. And I agree that slavery is an inseparable part of our nation's history. Even it being 2024, I don't believe makes a difference, because there are factually some institutions that if you say they still don't benefit from it, they have been put in a position to still have benefited from it in the first place. And by it, I mean slavery, right? So it is woven into our nation's blood. Now, where the right is concerned is telling young black children in schools that they are less than, and they are going to be discriminated against, and they are going to have less opportunities. I'm not going to say that doesn't happen. That is kind of like a liberal, well-meaning folly, where you think you're doing a service and you think you're being diverse and you think you're being inclusive. But I agree that you should not be telling black children that because of the color of their skin, they're going to be less than. In my psychology class, we talk about privilege, and we talk about what that could mean in certain situations, but I definitely don't teach it as like a all-encompassing restricting law. The next one is COVID and vaccines. There was a brief time right before COVID where there was a lot of talk on the internet about vaccines causing autism. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, in the year of our Lord, 2019, there was a sect of people in the world who were upset about vaccines. And me being on my high horse, which tends to not end well in these political situations, as we've seen, I was like, oh my God, what century is this argument from, that vaccines cause autism and that vaccines are bad and that parents are purposely not vaccinating their children? Like, it just disgusted me. Then COVID happened. And what that looked like in the classroom was, and I agree with this to an extent, this is just factual information. We could not discuss COVID status if a child was positive or negative for COVID, right? We also were not allowed to discuss vaccinations, because now, post-Trump, vaccinations were again something that children had opinions about from their parents, mainly, that we as the teacher had to protect and not offend and not something to the extent of like not bashing kids for not being vaccinated, right? So, okay, so on a base level, I agree with that. But now my morals are being put to the test again. And of course, I'm like, well, vaccination is the only way. And I'm like, now what do I do? Science is in favor of vaccines. And now we have a group of people that are not vaccinating their children because all of a sudden they don't believe in it when they believed in it up until COVID. And, it really did become political. Now, I'm going to be fair. I'm going to be fair and say that obviously some people did not respond well to the vaccinations. Some people are experiencing long-term complications that could possibly be traced back to the vaccinations. I know no scientific research, but it seems to me that the amount of deaths from COVID and the long-term effects of COVID are also factors that need to be considered. So it could possibly, unfortunately, be another one of those situations where we have to assess the lesser of two evils. I was vaccinated. I had COVID one time, knock on wood. It lasted 4 days, and I experienced no long-term repercussions, knock on wood, so far. Where some people I know who got COVID, their smelling and tasting changed forever. Their health was complicated forever. So it's not as simple as vaccine good, vaccine bad. There are a lot of other things into accounts. In the sake of fairness, I do want to also address, the government's role in vaccinations and how maybe people weren't upset about the vaccinations, but they were upset that the government was demanding that they get vaccinated for their line of work. That is something that I acknowledge, but I am not going to speak to because it just simply was not my narrative. It did not affect me. I was vaccinated, and I always had planned on getting vaccinated. So I am just letting you know, the listener, that I acknowledge that, but I just don't have the means to go into that right now. And I just want to say that when someone did have COVID, it truly was like a code red situation. We were sworn to secrecy, and it felt scary. Looking back, it's easy to laugh at this, but it did genuinely feel like, oh my God, I was in contact with someone with COVID. Like, I'm going to die, right? But then it did just so casually become, in the following years, either the kids would come to school and be like, oh, I had COVID. Or, so-and-so's out, they have COVID, right? So it started out very scary and secret and code red, but obviously it has been normalized since then. Thankfully, COVID and vaccine discourse are not so much a part of the daily classroom experience anymore. More so of like, how has COVID affected schools and education and learners now that we are shifting into post-COVID. The last thing I want to talk about in this section is January 6th. January 6th was a horrifying event, in my opinion, and I know that people who are right-leaning already have rolled their eyes to me saying that. I don't know how people on the right think it was such a small deal. I, for 6 hours, watched the news. I watched people storming the Capitol, another eye roll, I caught you, and no help was coming, no help at all. And this was in response to Biden winning the election and, people not agreeing with that. And even Mike Pence, the former vice president, was going to be overseeing the signing of this transition of power. And I watched while no one did anything, and people flooded the Capitol. Now, some people were killed. And thankfully, people on the right do have enough sense and wherewithal to be like, well, if you storm the Capitol, I think that is something that you can expect to happen. But it was like, this girl, trigger warning. This girl was like climbing through a barricaded door, and this personnel shot and killed her. And there was an outcry of like, look how they're treating us. Look what is happening. And it's like, you're storming the Capitol, like the most, or supposed to be the most secure place in the United States. At the very least, you can expect that this is not a safe situation, right? So at least most people I know are not on that train. But man, to people on the right, January 6th was just like a fleeting display of like dummies and hillbillies, and it had no major implications. It had no major effects. It was not a threat, and I just very seriously did not feel that way. So in the classroom, how do I address this major event that just occurred? It's funny because I believe we were still half on Zoom, and I, again, just as I did with the election, was just trying to explain like, hey, you may have heard this on the news. This is something that happened. And don't you think that kids at the very least would expect their U.S. history teacher to talk about it? Like, what kind of U.S. history teacher would I be if I didn't talk about it? And would that show my political bias and my political leaning if I ignored it? So someone was very upset about me talking about January 6th. And they were saying, well, what about the black riots? And what about this and that? And it's just so funny that we can't, and I'm going to say for both sides, we can't just sit down and say that one of these events was bad and have that be like an agreed upon all thing. The other side always has to throw in that other thing, right? We can't just sit around in a circle as Americans and say January 6th was bad. We have to say, well, what about the black riots and BLM and the fires and the targets and all that kind of stuff? So that was one response I had in the classroom that day. In response to me reporting what had happened, well, what about, all you do is talk about black history and black people, and now this, you're talking about this. The other thing I struggled with in the classroom was some people were saying January 6th was done by Antifa. I needed a moment. I was like, the right and conservatives have so much brain rot that with your eyes, that's what I told them. Look with your eyes. You see with your eyes who is doing this. You're going to blame Antifa. You're going to blame this on black activism or black extremist groups. Really? So that was another thing in my career where it's like, now current events are controversial. And now I can't report news without someone getting upset. And I have to worry about me getting in trouble, So those are all things that have been complicated in a post-Trump election. I now have to weigh facts against feelings, and in some cases, it does lead to me omitting information. Now, if you're a right-leaning person, or you're a conservative, or you're a Republican, and you've made it this far, I have a treat for you. I am going to end this episode by addressing the liberal craziness that has occurred since Trump's presidency. You see, for the most part, I feel like Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and liberals were on a slow track to whatever means they felt were their end goal. They were on a slow track to the progression of their individual needs. But 2016 set both damn parties on a fast track to craziness, and the left is not excluded from that narrative. And I want to acknowledge that. So here we go. So as I said in the beginning of this episode, up until the 2016 election, we have enjoyed a smooth progression of rights, in my opinion. The right is concerned about all of these new labels, these new identities, these new things that are coming to the surface at a more rapid speed than ever, okay? Now, I'm not here to bash the left regarding this because I really don't care how people live their lives. But mainly, one of the issues that has been prominent is the trans issue and the pronouns issues. So I just want to address some of those concerns that, liberal education is out of control, and I still have never seen a news story come across my feed of any of these anecdotes or any of these stories. I only hear them from conservatives who are responding to liberals that say that never happens. And when liberals say that never happens, they pull out this niche backwoods county school in a state where something, happened. And then in addition to that, I would like a source, because some of these anecdotes, I feel like being in the school system and knowing how school works, it just can't be the whole story, right? Like someone will say, actually, there was a debate online where a conservative said, the teacher asked for the kids' pronouns in third grade, and my daughter stood up and she said, I believe in God, and God makes no mistakes about who I am, and she got sent to the principal's office. And even with the little information that I have, I just find it hard to believe that that's all of what happened. And I've known a lot of people on the right, or religious people, that are like, all my child said was that they believe in God and they got sent to the principal's office. Okay, if that was the case, that would be a problem. But I just don't think that's the whole story, because I'm only hearing your perspective. But for the sake of fairness, I want to address some of these claims, and I have seen some proof that some crazy things are happening. I first want to say, I think when LGBTQ plus people hand over expectations or initiatives to straight people, that is the first area for error. So you have overwhelmingly heterosexual people in school administration calling the shots. You have overwhelmingly heterosexual people teaching, and so it becomes kind of what they think they should do and teach rather than what LGBTQ plus people are asking for. For instance, I'm asking for a penguin with two penguin dads book be put in an elementary classroom. So if a kid stumbles upon it, they may have questions, or they may feel represented, or whatever. I'm asking that children's identities be respected. I'm asking that, if they come to you with a name or a this or a that, that, at the very least, you handle it respectfully. When I remember this because I have a great memory. When I was in kindergarten, it was the 90s, and I was obsessed with Sailor Moon. And the first day we went in was kind of like it wasn't school, but it was like a meet your kindergarten teacher, and the tablecloths were covered with paper, and you can color on them with crayons. And they asked me what my name was, and I told them my name was Sailor Earth. And their response was, they laughed it off, and they were like, okay, well, how about, you can be Sailor Earth for the rest of the day. I dropped it. I never wanted to be called Sailor Earth again. It wasn't an issue, right? Pronouns are English grammar. So conservatives self-own when they say that they don't use pronouns, because everyone uses pronouns. Now, I'm going to tell you what I don't agree with from the previous examples that I gave. I don't agree with children below the age of 6th grade learning about sex, right? So there have been cases of teachers being accused of teaching their children about sexual content of any kind, and that I don't agree with. The pronoun thing is tricky for me. I know that many of my left-leaning brothers and sisters and family, and all-encompassing, would say that that's important to introduce to children. Unless a child feels like they personally have a problem, I don't know. Because there is some truth to, if you introduce this idea to children that they never thought was possible, are they going to adopt that as an interest? Does that make sense? A kid may want to identify as a she or a her who genuinely is not trans and genuinely doesn't want to be she, her, but if they are in an environment where you can pick anything you want, I just don't think you can ignore that. On the flip side, you do have, and this is where people on the right would disagree with me, legitimately trans children. Legitimately children who think that they are the opposite sex and who will go on to transition and live happy and fulfilled lives. I think those children exist and we can't ignore those children, right? So I'm looking out, if I was an elementary school teacher, I'm looking out for those kids that express themselves that difference. I don't necessarily need to introduce that difference to them, if that makes any sense. But you can push back with me and say, like, well, if so-and-so has two moms or two dads, yeah, that is going to be a part of the classroom discussion. It should be. And it should not be ignored. It should not be skirted around. And it should be taught to be respected, right? But I do see some cases of teachers kind of going overwhelmingly like what they think they should be saying. And I think maybe that's just a lack of personal experience on their part or them not being LGBTQ. Again, there has to be a balance. There has to be a happy medium between introducing how other people live their lives differently, but not like enforcing it, right, on children and not teaching them about things that are not appropriate for their age and stuff like that. So I said all that to say that in 2016, we had a split where Republicans got crazier and the left got crazier and Democrats got crazier real quick. And we're both headed in a crazy and a fast direction. And that's where kind of like some level-headedness is called for and some reflecting is called for. But that is my experience about how the classroom has changed post-Trump. Things that weren't controversial before him are now controversial. Real life happenings and facts that I now have to figure out how I'm going to present, if I'm going to present. And I am looking for the 2024 election and how I will approach my kids with the relevant information. I will say, though, kids are very smart, and I think that young people in general today are very aware that these are not two ideal choices. I think that young people today are very fatigued from hearing about these two choices. So I don't anticipate a repeat of the 2024 election that I had in 2020. I think we're in hell world enough that we're just going to begrudgingly accept whatever is handed to us. So this has been Exit Talks, and thank you for listening.